It had been an exhilarating and exhausting 2 years, and though almost every defeated candidate insists the experience was wonderful and satisfying, I imagine I was only slightly less pleased that it was over than was President-elect Obama. Don't get me wrong, I fought as hard as I could to win, and I really don't enjoy losing. We had triumphant moments and deeply touching experiences in the campaign. We had disappointing experiences as well, and days that were blown by adrenaline-fueled activity and stress. It was like drinking from a fire hose all day, every day, especially in the months between the party confessions and election day. But it had been, for the most part, a wonderful experience. While some might find it hard, the part I enjoyed the most were the days when I was again an underdog for the Republican nomination. I'm not sure why, but my enjoyment of a fight of any kind is inversely proportional to the odds of winning it. And in July of 2007, the odds that I would win the Republican nomination for president were starting to look pretty long. I had formally announced my candidacy in April, but the campaign had been underway for months before then. It had started out I had started out as the presumed front-runner for the nomination, and my friend Hillary Clinton, whom I had gotten to know and like while serving with her on the Armed Service Committee, was a front-runner for the Democratic nomination. Her status would last a bit longer than mine. We had built a front-runners campaign with a large and experienced staff and a big budget. Much too big, it turned out. We were spending a lot more than we were raising. It's not the most I'm not the most prodigious fundraiser, to be sure. I don't mind asking people for money, but I don't really enjoy it either. And I certainly wasn't as good at it as my principal rival for the nomination, Governor Mitt Romney. I suppose it did not help matters with my donors that I was the leading Republican proponent of limiting campaign donation, or that I was inextricably tied to the deeper unpopular surge in Iraq. Yeah, I remember the surge, the good old days of Bush Americanism instead of Trump's Americanism. Let me see what's ESPN talk about. It is 5 a.m. on the West Coast and 8 a.m. on the East Coast. See, right now I should have stopped and when I made hoodoo and it says in my morning praise right now.
And look at it now, though. There has to be some protected way in the Senate, in that Judiciary Committee.
FBI looking into Judge Kavanaugh and witnesses is not enough. Hello, for them, it will never be enough. Stay tuned and watch.
So it's going to be very interesting. So far, we talked to Debbie Ramirez, the Yale then student, like Adelaide Sports Center.
When things are going wrong, then a team likes to go to something that feels like bread and butter, and that's something they can do at Levy.
We call you Chaka Chaka Ride. That's a man say. Can I get them off? Make them soft, make them soft. My support for comprehensive immigration reform was proven to be a liability as well. Although majorities then and now support its provisions, I had sponsored an immigration bill that year with Ted Kennedy. The bill was as unpopular with some conservatives as Ted was. Some of the other candidates, particularly Mitt Romney, was already making an issue of it, and it was starting to generate grassroots opposition to my candidacy. Hey, y'all remember when that Mother Jones 47% Mitt Romney leaked video came out during the Obama campaign against Mitt Romney in 2012? I think this was around the time he had said that whole 47% of things. Whatever the reasons for my failure to outweigh the competition, our spending should have been more in line with our financing. We shouldn't have assembled an operation with as big as payroll and expense as we had until my front-runner status was earned by winning primaries. In the spring and early summer of 2007, it was based on not much more than the fact that I had been the front-runner for the nomination in 2000 and was at the moment better known nationally than Governor Romney. I was, to put it mildly, unhappy with my situation and considering what to do about it when I left for an overseas trip in early July. The whole thing, the whole thing just didn't feel right to me. I felt as if I was running someone else's campaign or pretending my campaign was something it wasn't or shouldn't have been. I had enjoyed my experiences as the underdog in the 2000 President Republican nomination race, partly because hardly anyone expected me to win and I felt as if I had nothing to lose. Then we caught fire in the fall of 1999, won the New Hampshire primary in a landslide, and had a rocket ride for a couple of months, losing South Carolina, winning Michigan before crashing in the Super Tuesday primaries. I left the race having outperformed expectations, possessing a much bigger national reputation, increased influence in the Senate, and an abundance of truly wonderful memories. Not bad for a defeat. Before I made the decision to run again, I had nagging doubts that I mentioned frequently to aides that we weren't likely to battle lightning twice. Compounding my concerns over spending and direction of the campaign in 2007 was my concerns about the surge in Iraq, which preoccupied me more than the campaign did. There had not been many advocates in Congress, even among Republicans, for President George W. Bush's decision to surge troops into Iraq to run a counterinsurgency under the command of General Davis Petraeus. Yo, they had such a negative campaign against this guy. Every time I see this guy's name now, I can't help but hear the negative phrasing they had used for his name. You know what I mean? I'm not going to say because I kind of respected the guy a little bit, but still, man, when they were to bring you down, yo, when they were, when they were to bring your shit down, man, it's a wrap. Can't understand the way of that. The war had been almost lost in 2006. A Sunni insurgency had grown much stronger as it claimed more territory, and more Iraqis and foreign fighters were joining its ranks. Shia, Shia militias were working with Iran to terrorize Sunnis, and when the spirits moved them to kill Americans. They operated practically unfettered in some neighborhoods. They were obviously losing ground and were at risk of losing the war. That reality wasn't altered by repeated assurances from senior commanders in Baghdad and from Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld that the American efforts in Iraq was meeting all its targets. Principally, the number of Iraqi troops trained, which proved as useless as a measure of success as body counts had in Vietnam. And the majority of the American people, which grew larger by the day, wanted us to get out. I had been advocating for a counterinsurgency campaign in Iraq since August 2003. I had lost all confidence in Secretary Rumsfeld's willingness to change what clearly wasn't working, and I said so. The vampire Babylon season. I had been advocating for a counterinsurgency campaign in Iraq since August 2003. I had lost all confidence in Secretary Rumsfeld's willingness to change what clearly wasn't working, and I said so. To my and many others' reliefs, President Bush asked for his resignation in November 2006. Knowing the president was actively considering the idea, I had urged for months that we surge thousands more troops to Iraq. I knew it was a decision that some officials in his administration opposed, that Democrats and more than a few Republicans would strongly criticize, and that most of the American people would not agree with. They had already punished Republicans for Iraq in the 2006 midterm elections. They would likely want to rebuke us again in 2008. And that probability will loom larger as casualties spiked in the first months of the surge. President Bush knew all this as well or better than I did. Good man that he is, I knew he was deeply pained by the loss of Americans he had sent to Iraq. He knew that if he decided to order the surge, the situation would get worse and more Americans would die before it got better. He knew there was no guarantee it would succeed. We had gone into Iraq based on faulty intelligence about weapons of mass destruction and destroyed the odious Saddam Hussein regime. Bad tactics, a flawed strategy, and bad leadership in the highest ranks of uniformed and civilian defense leadership has allowed violent forces unleashed by Saddam's destruction to turn Iraq into hell on earth and threaten the stability of the Middle East. The situation was dire, and the price that we had already paid in blood and treasure was dear. But we had a lot at stake, and we had a responsibility to attempt one last extreme, difficult effort to turn it around, to test whether a genuine counterinsurgency could avert defeat. The president chose to do the right thing, and the hardest. I imagine it was a lonely, painful experience for him, and I admired his resolve. I admired also his choice to lead the effort, General David Petraeus. I believe that we should have responded to the insurgency at its inception, and I was increasingly convinced with every month that followed that only a full-fledged counterinsurgency with all the force it required had any chance for winning the war. But I didn't know in late 2006 whether or not the situation was too far gone to salvage. Advisors whose counsel I trusted believed it still could be won. General Petraeus believed it could be, but none of us felt as confident about the outcome as we would have liked, and we knew most Americans believed we were wrong. 5 additional Army brigades were deployed to Iraq, and Marine and Army units already in country had their tours extended, providing just enough force to support a counterinsurgency. The numbers of Americans killed or wounded in the first month of 2007 increased substantially as additional forces arrived and fought to take back territory from Sunni insurgents and Shia militants. For the first time in the war on a large scale, they held the ground they took and provided security for the affected populations. The spike in casualty was expected, but it was hard not to worry you were needlessly sending young kids to their death in a war that had been a mistake. You couldn't help but wonder if maybe the best thing now was to cut our losses, but I believed our defeat would be catastrophic for the Middle East and our security interests as those terrorists in Tehran gained power and prestige at our expense. And I was worried about the humanitarian implications of our withdrawal, fearing that the raging sectarian war might descend into genocide. Of course, if the surge failed, there would be nothing we could realistically do to prevent that defeat or prevent history or in our consciences from damning us for having made this last costly effort. So, as I considered what to do about my campaign, I did so recognizing that I would be spending more time and energy focusing on the issue that was likely to cost me votes. Nowhere was that likely to be the case than in my favorite state, in my favorite state after Arizona, New Hampshire, scene of my 2000 landslide win. In the 2006 election, Democrats had swept almost every state and federal contest in New Hampshire. The Republican wipeout blamed on voters' deep dissatisfaction with the war. There was no credible scenario in which I could win the nomination without winning the New Hampshire primary, as I had in 2000. And even Granite State voters who had supported me 7 years before and who still liked me were not pleased with my support for the war. It was increasingly apparent that many of them would express their displeasure by voting for a candidate other than me. Anxious about the surge, upset with the state of my campaign, increasingly aware of the extent of the challenge before me, I was in a bad frame of mind that summer. My uncertainty about what to do only aggravated my condition. There have been very few times in my life when I have felt I might be in a predicament that I could not eventually escape. But I had serious doubts that I could win an election and maintain my position in Iraq. In fact, I was beginning to ask myself if I should even be trying. And that was my attitude as I departed with my friend Senator Lindsey Graham for I told you, man, John McCain invoked so many trips him, Lindsey, and Joe Lieberman took in this book. It's sad. It saddens me that McCain is not alive. I swear, if McCain was alive, Lindsey Graham would not have went off the way he went off at that Kavanaugh hearing, because he knew. Even on his deathbed, McCain would have probably sent him a message that would have pulled at his heartstrings to realize that yes, he's wrong in where he's going with his politics right now. I'm speaking about Lindsey Graham now, but like, and they were friends, you know what I mean? They were both from the same party, but still, they were friends. That's why it's so sad. May you rest in peace, Mr. McCain. May you rest in perfect peace indeed. And that was my attitude as I departed with my friend Senator Lindsey Graham for a long scheduled trip to Iraq, leaving decisions about how to repair my campaign or even whether to continue it for my return. On the flight over, I confided to Lindsey my unhappiness with the campaign, and we discussed what I ought to do about it. I told him I was leaning towards getting out of the race. I wasn't sure I could win. I wasn't sure I wanted it badly enough to do what I had to do to win. We were broke. Unlike our merry little band of insurgents in 2000, factions had formed in the campaign, and they were sniping at each other in the press. Old friendships were becoming rivalries. It was an increasingly joyless experience, and I had begun to worry that it would ultimately prove pointless. Lindsey thought it was salvageable, that we could downsize and fight more like a challenger than a frontrunner. If nothing else, that would feel more natural to me. But I was skeptical. I would need to raise a lot more money to run any kind of serious campaign. And that would get harder, not easier, as donors saw us cutting payroll, shedding talented staff, and closing state offices 6 months before the Iowa caucuses. We were about to become, in the eyes of the media and donors, the first casualty of the 2008 Republican nomination race. There was violence that had started to subside by the time of our July visit to Baghdad, which strengthened our faith that the surge could succeed. Casualties had peaked in May. The number of killed and wounded declined every month thereafter. General Petraeus and Ambassador Ryan Crocker and their staffs briefed us on the military and political gains that had been made since our last visit. We could see for ourselves that things were improving. There were visible signs of progress almost everywhere in Baghdad. Dangerous neighborhoods had been quieted. Commercial activity was resuming. There wasn't enough progress to convince you that victory was assured, far from it. But it was enough to think that maybe, to quote Churchill, we were at the end of the beginning. It was more hopeful that the decision I had long advocated would not end up sacrificing the lives ransomed to it in a failed effort to rescue an already lost cause. The experience that made the biggest impression on me was his ceremonial one. General Petraeus had asked us to participate in an Independence Day event as Saddam's Alfort Palace at Camp Victory that included the re-enlistment of over 600 soldiers and the naturalization of 161 soldiers, mostly Hispanic immigrants who had risked their lives and limb for the United States while they waited to become citizens. Some of these soldiers, the re-enlisted and the newly naturalized, were on their second and third combat tours. Some of them had just some of them had just had their current tours extended. Most were kids, of course, and some of them had spent 2 or 3 years of their short lives living with fear and fatigue, cruelty and confusion, and all the other dehumanizing effects of war. They had seen friends killed and wounded. Some had been wounded themselves. They had seen firsthand the failed strategy that had allowed the insurgency to gain strength, and had risked their lives to reinforce what they knew was a mistake. They had retaken the same real estate over and over again. They had conducted raids night after night looking for insurgents and cache of arms. They had been shot at by snipers and blasted by IEDs, and buried friends who hadn't survived the encounters, while month after month the situation got worse. And here they were reopened again, choosing to stay in harm's way. Most of them, it appeared, were excited to be finally doing something that makes sense, taking and holding ground, protecting and earning the trust of the locals. Lindsay and I spoke at the ceremony. We were awed by them. It was hard to keep our composure while witnessing that kind of courage and selfless devotion to duty. And it was all the harder after General Petraeus recognized the sacrifices made by 2 soldiers who had planned to become naturalized citizens at the ceremony and were now represented by 2 pairs of boots on 2 chairs, having been killed in actions 2 days before. They died serving a country that was not yet theirs, Petraeus observed. I wasn't the only person there with a lump in their throat and eyes brimming with tears. I wish every American who, out of ignorance or worse, curses immigrants as criminals or a drain on the country's resources or a threat to our culture, could have been there. I would like them to know that immigrants, many of them having entered the country illegally, were making sacrifices for Americans that many Americans will not make for them. 62 million white Americans have voted for Trump. What have you done for your country but vote for this dumbass? The ceremony was one of the most inspirational displays of genuine loyalty to country and comrade I'd ever witnessed, and I will never forget it. On our return flight, Lindsay and I again discussed my political predicament and what to do about it. But I had decided before we boarded the flight that whatever I was risking by remaining a candidate, which wasn't much more than embarrassment, it was nothing compared to what those kids were risking and the cause they were fighting for. I decided to stay in the race. We had to downsize substantially. Many staffers left of their own accord and others involuntarily. We closed our operations in a number of states. We borrowed money to keep the thing going. We developed a living off the land strategy that relied on debates and other free media opportunities to get our message out. We couldn't afford to pay to advertise. We had to adjust our expectations accordingly. I wasn't able to run campaign operations with paid staff in as many primaries and caucuses as we had planned. We were going to have to downplay our involvement in the Iowa caucuses, as we had 8 years before, and bet it all on New Hampshire again. We will be active in the states that immediately followed New Hampshire: Michigan, which was Governor Romney's native state, and South Carolina. We knew we would have to win at least one of those to have a decent shot at winning the Florida primary. Whoever won Florida Whoever won Florida would have the most momentum going into Super Tuesday, when 21 states will hold primaries or caucuses. But for all the political purposes, it was New Hampshire or bust for us again. There wasn't a way to win without it. I made one other commitment. I wouldn't just stand by my position on the surge. I would make it the centerpiece of our campaign, arguing for its necessity and predicting its success if sustained. a message that many New Hampshire voters did not welcome. I couldn't win the nomination without winning New Hampshire. I probably couldn't win New Hampshire if I continued to support the surge. But I was going to make defending the surge my principal message in New Hampshire. An underdog again. My very first campaign stop after returning from Iraq was in Concord, New Hampshire, where I was scheduled to deliver a speech on Iraq. Before we left, I planned to speak in the Senate about the progress Lindsay and I had witnessed and the necessity of sustaining the surge beyond its difficult first month. Before the speech, in difficult conversation with senior staff, I ordered the downsizing that necessitated staff departures, provoked bitter feelings between former colleagues and angry recriminations in the press, and spawned hours of political prognostications that our campaign was, for all political purposes, a corpse as my days as a frontrunner came to an abrupt and messy end. I did not have an elaborate response to the situation. Rick Davis, my campaign manager, was working on a plan to run a smaller campaign and find the money for. I decided the best thing I could do was to put my head down and plod through the next few weeks. I like to say I ignored the skepticism and mockery directed my way, but I heard it and read it and felt it. I didn't like it, but I didn't let it intimidate me. I intended to go to New Hampshire and make my case to people I had a pretty good rapport with, even if they were no longer supporting me. If they didn't buy it, so be it. I wouldn't be present. I didn't want this to sound flip because it's not as if I didn't want to win. I did. I'm a very competitive person. But I just decided that if I was likely to lose and was going to run away, I shouldn't be afraid of losing. And I was going to run anyway, I shouldn't be afraid of losing. I had something to say. I thought it was important that I said, and I would see the damn thing through. On a Friday morning in July, I boarded a flight to New Hampshire at Reagan National Airport with my youngest son Jimmy, a Marine who was about to deploy on his first combat tour, and my administrative assistant and co-writer Mark Salter. No other staff accompanied me. Flights to Manchester, New Hampshire in primary season are usually crowded with Washington reporters. Press accounts quickly proliferated that I had been spotted in much reduced circumstances carrying my own bag to the gate. I had carried my own bag before then. I almost always carried it. As a matter of fact, although it was another thing I was accustomed to do for myself that the Secret Service would eventually relieve me of. I didn't care that reporters remarked on it. The image gave me a handy metaphor for our humble campaign. I kind of liked it. When we arrived at the venue in Concord, which if I remember correctly was hosted by the local Chamber of Commerce, the room was congested with reporters, including some of the most well-known and respected in the country. I knew most of them and I liked many of them. A half dozen TV cameras were there to record the moment. Although we had announced I would be making remarks about the situation in Iraq, reporters seen that what they thought was the chaos and confusion that beset the campaign and its death throes, suspected or hoped that I would withdraw from the race then and there. They were like crows on a wire, watching the unfortunate roadkill breathe its last before they descended to scavenge the remains. I made my speech. It wasn't a memorable one, I'm afraid, but it did not include an announcement that I was ending my campaign. Professionals that they are, none of the reporters present betrayed their disappointment that they had been denied their birthday at sin. Most of them believed I was a ghost candidate who would sooner or later realize that he was not part of this world any longer. For my part, I would stick to my scheduled appearances for the time being while we sorted through tough decisions we would have to make about strategy, staffing, and financing. The next morning, I held a town hall meeting at the American Legion Post in Claremont. Most of the questions were about Iraq. Most of them were skeptical, and a few hostile. On a summer night a month later, I was halfway through a town hall meeting in Wolfboro and had answered the usual questions about the war, federal spending, immigration, climate change, veterans care, questions I got at every event. Nothing out of the ordinary had yet occurred when a middle-aged woman stood and gestured to the staffer holding the microphone. When he handed it to her, she started speaking in a quiet voice. When you've done as many town halls as I have, you can tell in an instant the people who are used to questioning candidates and those who are uncomfortable with public attention. Lynn Savage, a special education assistant in the local school system, and the mother was a latter. I sensed as I called on her that she had something to say that would affect me. I thought it might be a criticism. She was standing just a few feet from me, shy but purposeful. She prefaced her question by recalling that during the Vietnam War she had proudly worn a silver bracelet on her arm in support of a soldier who was fighting. Then she got to her point. Today, unfortunately, I wear a black bracelet in memory of my son who lost his life in Baghdad. My first thought in the instant she uttered her statement was that she would hold me responsible for her loss, and she would be right to do so. By my vote in support of the war and my support for the surge, I assumed a share of that responsibility, and the Gold Star model was well within her right to resent me for. But she didn't speak of resentment or accountability. She only She had only come to ask if I would wear his bracelet, so you could remember your mission and their mission in support of them. The room was completely still. My emotions began to swell and I worried I would lose my composure. I managed to get out. I will be honored and grateful before giving her a hug. Don't let his sacrifice be in vain, she instructed me. I took the bracelet from her and read the name inscribed on it. Matthew Stanley. I asked her how old Matthew had been. 22, she replied. 22, I repeated. My voice cracked a little as I thanked her for his service. All I could find, all I could, all I could find the wit and will to say after that was, "Yes, ma'am, I will wear this. Thank you." Specialist Matthew Stanley was 2 months into his second tour in Iraq in December 2006 when an IED destroyed the MV he was in, killing him and 4 other soldiers. He was 10 days shy of his 23rd birthday. Damn. Damn. Man, I'm getting goosebumps right now because I'm about his age. I'm just saying, man. He was born in December, around December, November, or January, one of the two. And he was still a newlywed, having married Amy the previous New Year's Eve. I wore Matthew Stanley's bracelet every day of the campaign, and I've worn it every day since. I'll wear it for the rest of my life. Why not make a virtue of necessity? Steve Smith, who was acting as a volunteer strategy for us, had proposed a few days before the Wolfboro Town Hall. His speech went something like this. You're broke, you're down in the polls, you're not drawing crowds, the press has moved on. Why not get some of your POW buddies and other friends to travel with you while you hold small events all over New Hampshire and make the case for the surge? Go to VFW and American Legion halls, to people's backyards if you have to, and tell them you're not quitting on the men and women we sent to fight for us in Iraq, even if it costs you the election. Voters like seeing politicians stick to their guns, especially if it looks like it's going to cost them the election. Call it the No Surrender Tour. It made sense to me. We began that September and traveled in vans and cars at first. Buses were expensive. Some of the earliest events were held in people's homes, which ones exactly bursting with crowds of cheering people. I traveled with old pals from prison, Bud Day, Austin Swindle, and others, as well as my dearest friends in the Senate, Lindsey Graham and Joe Lieberman. I got to say what I wanted to say, what I believe was important to say and true. Ending every speech with what with what, depending on your point of view, was either a buzz or a prediction. I'd rather lose an election than see my country lose a war. You know what's so funny? This thought just popped in my head after McCain's line here. I'd rather lose an election than see my country lose a war. That's what the Trump campaign should have told the Russians that had damned in information on Hillary Clinton. I'd rather lose an election than see my country be infected in the way that's been infected by America's biggest enemy. If they would have done that, all this mess would have been prevented. If they would have looked at whichever Russian came to them with that intelligence, with that information that they could help him win the election, they should have looked them dead in the eye and told them, nah. But 62 million of his supporters right now are thinking in their heads, yeah, I wouldn't do that either. We gotta get all this shit that nigga had put up in there out of there. You know. Yeah. Now you see the difference between McCain, the real American, and Trump, the. Being an underdog with low expectations can be liberating and fun. The humor gets a little dark, but that's often the most fortifying kind. I have a quote I jokingly attribute to Chairman Mao that I like to use in tough situations. It's always darkest before it's completely black. I remember Lindsay and I were excited when we arrived at the VFW hall one Friday night and found the place packed with people. We must be catching up, we congratulated ourselves, only to learn that it was fried fish night, an event so popular with the locals they were willing to put up with the annoyance of politicians interrupting their supper. We eventually got a bus, wrapped it in our new motto, no surrender, and rolled along the highways of the Granite State, stumping for the surge and my struggling candidacy wherever we could find people to listen. That was YouTube assuming I'm not listening anymore, so they just stopped. Where's that man? Joseph Hill, may you rest in perfect peace, brother. It worked. We slowly started to revive. The crowds grew modestly. My poll numbers improved slightly, and the press started paying a little more attention. I doubt reporters thought I was a serious contender for the nomination again, but they believed I might fight until the New Hampshire primary. I think most of them appreciated that I was a proven campaigner in New Hampshire. I also think most of them expected Governor Romney to win the expensive, labor-intensive Iowa caucuses and probably have enough momentum coming out of Iowa to beat me in New Hampshire, where he had a vacation home and was well known and liked. A defeat in New Hampshire will surely force my exit from the race. We had to hit a triple bank shot to stay viable. I had to place respectably in Iowa without being seen to have made a major investment of time and money there. One of the other candidates had to win or come awfully close to winning Iowa, so the press would declare Governor Romney had underperformed expectations. Then I had to win New Hampshire on the strength of a good grassroots organization, nostalgia for my 2000 campaign by independents who can vote in New Hampshire party primaries, respect for my open style of campaigning, taking all questions and abuse, and my willingness to tell people what they didn't want to hear and still ask for their vote. I like and respect Mitt Romney. I think he would have made a very good president. No, he wouldn't have. Nah, I don't agree with you there, Mr. McCain. I liked him before we ran against each other, and I liked him after we were finished running against each other. In between, I and my more demonstrative staffers worked up a little situational antipathy for the governor and his campaign. That's natural, of course. Presidential campaigns are exhausting, stressful experiences, run on coffee, adrenaline, and fear. And when you need a little extra boost, resentment of your opponent can be a handy motivator. Mitt is an intelligent, accomplished, decent, convivial man. who is very good at raising money and looks like a movie star. Deep into the endless series of primary debates, I and other candidates were looking a little worse for wear. Mitch always arrived looking as if he had just finished from a 2 week vacation at the beach, tan and smiling and utterly self possessed. If you are not constantly reminding yourself to behave like an adult, you might start getting a little pissed off at your opponent's many fine attributes. That kind of childishness usually ends when the contest is over, as it did with our campaigns. But when the game is on between very competitive people, something akin to trash talking to the press can happen, as was the case with us. Nothing below the belt really from either side, just jabs here and there, enough to make you want to well beat the other guy. We had worked hard, we had a strategy we could afford, and we got lucky. Iowa worked out about as well as it could have under the circumstances. A late surgeon, Governor Mike Huckabee, if you are wondering who that is Sarah Huckabee's daddy. The same racist blood flows through the family, so that's why I pointed that out. A late surging Governor Mike Huckabee, who had extensive support in Iowa's evangelical community, the most influential and well-represented black of Republican caucus voters, caught me and a lot of the press, if not by surprise. It was evident in the last round of polls. Then unprepared for the magnitude of his victory. Huckabee ended up winning the thing by a 9 point margin, which meant Mitt would only be deprived of momentum coming out of Iowa. He would drop in the polls in reaction to the unexpected size of his defeat there. I had managed to come in a respectable fourth, only a couple hundred votes behind third place finisher, my friend Fred Thompson. May he rest in peace too. Arthur Branch. It's all an expectation game. The press thought I had put in the time in Iowa and didn't have a real organization there, but I had just enough of both to do well enough to avoid hurting myself in New Hampshire. I wasn't overconfident about learning the Iowa results, but I did think I was now the candidate to beat in the New Hampshire primary 5 days later. I had a small lead in most of the latest polls. Huckabee didn't have much support there, but his win in Iowa had likely cost Mitt some of his support. So as I heard the news from Iowa that night after finishing an event in New Hampshire, the guy who had come in fourth in the six-man field was after the actual winner, the happiest candidate in the race. I didn't expect to win a blowout as I had in 2000. My lead in the latest poll was in the 2 to 3 point range, way too tight to get cocky. But I was confident enough to ignore my usual superstition about not discussing my primary night speech before I knew whether we would celebrate a victory or consider defeat. The victory I the victory The victory I and just about everyone expected would be the biggest that night would likely belong to the candidate riding the most momentum out of Iowa and the biggest wave of enthusiasm. That was Senator Barack Obama, the eloquent newcomer to American politics, who had just defeated the front-runner Hillary Clinton in Iowa and given a victory speech that captured the imagination of Americans who were tired of politics, including many first-time voters. Like Michael Moore put it best that day, the whitest state in America just voted for a black man. He was speaking of Iowa. The victory I and just about everyone expected would be the biggest that night would likely belong to the candidate riding the most momentum out of Iowa and the biggest wave of enthusiasm. That was Senator Barack Obama, the eloquent newcomer to American politics, who had just defeated the frontrunner Hillary Clinton in Iowa and given a victory speech that captured the imaginations of Americans who were tired of politics, including many first-time voters. He appeared unstoppable after Iowa. Everyone assumed he would win New Hampshire too and drive Hillary out of the race. I discussed with David Salter and Schmidt the right message for my speech that night, and we agreed I should begin by saluting Senator Obama's historic achievements and recognize what it meant to his supporters and to the entire country. I would also express my hope that should I be the Republican nominee, our contest will be conducted in a way that would impress Americans in both parties as respectful. I miss those days, man. Respectable politics. I mean, some people probably think it ain't never politics, it never been respectable. It has. Yeah, you can come at your opponent, but it's a difference with having your supporters calling your opponent a lying bitch. That part. That sentiment wasn't only a sincere wish for more civility in politics. The country wanted change. They wanted the biggest change they could get. Barack Obama was offering them change, and he had advantages I did not. He was not a member of the party in power. I was. He was young and cool and new to politics. I was 71 years old and had been a known commodity for some time, with a long record of votes and statements to criticize. He opposed the unpopular war in Iraq. I supported it. He will be the first African American to earn a major party's presidential nomination. He represents a change in his very person. I had to convince people I too was a change candidate. But the most effective means I had to convey that message was campaigning the way that might appear novel and authentic to cynical voters. I intended to use my victory speech to start that effort. When it became clear that night that I had managed a come-from-behind victory, beating me by about 5 points, it was looking like Hillary might be doing the same. When the networks declared me the New Hampshire winner, the Democratic race was still too close to call, and we revised my speech accordingly. I began by noting I was too old to be called any kind of kid, but we sure showed them what a comeback looks like. I thank the people of New Hampshire for hearing me out even when they disagree with me. We were down in the poll and written off when we were here, I reminded them. And we had just one strategy, to tell you what I believe. Unable to congratulate the winner of the Democrats' primary, I paid my respect to the supporters of all candidates, Republicans and Democrats, who worked for a cause they believe is good for the country we all love. We had a long way to go. The Michigan primary was a little more than a week away. Mitt will be hard to beat there. South Carolina will be a close contest between Huckabee, Fred Thompson, and me. I needed to win one of them to continue. Winning both would be preferable, but South Carolina, the place where my rocket ride out of primary in 2000 class, loomed larger. 8 years before, I had stood on the steps of the Bedford, New Hampshire town hall the night before the primary and looked out on a sea of faces. There were people crowding the streets and intersections, extending several blocks. It was thrilling, and I knew I was on the cusp of my biggest political triumph. It remained to this day my favorite campaign memory. My 2008 primary win was not as heady as our victory in 2000. But I was deeply touched by it and have had ever since a special affection for the proud voters in the first in the nation primary. These people have been so good to us, I told Cindy that night. I owe them so much. The next day, somewhere in Iraq's Anbar province, my son Jimmy helped dig an MRAP, a heavily armored personnel carrier, out of the mud in a wadi that had flooded in a downpour. He was knee-deep in the muck, working a shovel and sweating in the oppressive heat when his sergeants called over to him. "McCain!" "Yes, Sergeant." "Your dad won New Hampshire." "Did he?" "Yeah, keep digging." "Yes, Sergeant." I laughed when Jimmy recounted the exchange for me when we were reunited some months later, and I laughed every time I retell it to my friends. But as I have remembered it in the years that followed and remember it too, my worry then was that my ambitions had exposed my youngest son to even greater danger. I moved to tears. Chapter 2, Country Force. I received a decent bump in the national polls following my New Hampshire win, and our fundraising picked up. Although we still had to pay off the bank loan we borrowed in the summer to keep the campaign running. National polling leads can create a false impression that someone is a frontrunner. We don't have national primaries. The next contest was in Michigan on January 15th, and Mitt and I were running neck and neck there. Michigan wasn't do or die for me, but it was for Mitt Romney. Huckabee and I had split the first two contests. Mitt had to get into the picture now or risk being written off by reporters and donors. South Carolina was 4 days after Michigan, and Mitt wasn't competing there. I saw the chance to finish him off and secure a nearly invincible position by winning Michigan and beating Huckabee and Fred Thompson in South Carolina. I had upset George Bush in the 2000 Michigan primary and believe I had a good feel for campaigning there. It's obviously a lot more populous. It's obviously a lot more populous in Auburn than New Hampshire, and I had spent a lot more time in New Hampshire than we could spend in Michigan. But I felt Michigan voters in 2000 had responded as well as New Hampshire voters had to my candor, which occasionally offered uncomfortable truths to an audience that might disagree. The Straight Talk Express, our Boston motto in 2000, mostly avoided being sanctimonious because now and again I had to pay a real price for it. I would say something in the name of straight talk that got me in trouble. We both fought hard for Michigan and threw punches that aggravated our campaigns already healthy game day animosity for the other. I took a shot at Mitt's record on taxes as Massachusetts governor. He accused me of being he accused me of being their most odious of characters, the Washington Insider. Most polls had us less than a percentage point apart. Then I offered Michigan voters a little dose of straight talk. It was true but harder here, and I have to watch myself and not appear small when I'm offering a hard truth. I can seem to enjoy being in, in politics. Michigan was in the throes of a deep recession and had the highest unemployment in the nation. Technology-driven productivity gains in the automobile industry and foreign competition had cost the state tens, if not thousands of jobs of high-wage manufacturing jobs. I campaigned on ideas to help people whose lives were disrupted by the global economy, getting workers into improved retraining programs and having the government make up some of the difference between the wages they had lost and the lower pay they were now earning in service industry jobs. But I wanted to acknowledge that work was permanently changing in the US in ways that would put a premium on education reform and highly skilled training to achieve the same standard of living that had been common for manufacturing workers in the last century. In the debate, I blurted out there are jobs that aren't coming back to Michigan. Meade jumped on it instantly, grabbing the opportunity to portray me as unsympathetic to dislocated workers and underscore his credentials as a successful businessman who specialized in turning around failing companies. In addition to having been governor of Michigan, Mitt's father George had been president of American Motors. Richard Rustin in Color of Law. There's a couple of parts that references Mitt Romney's father and his hand in
your house. Maybe we should build a wall to keep the Mexicans out. Or maybe we should send them all to the ghetto for now. I'm not racist. And I never lied, but I think there's a disconnect between your culture and mine. I worship the Einsteins, studied the Steve Jobs, but you ride Tupac's dick like he was a fucking god. Oh my god. And all you care about is rapping and stunting and being ratchet, and that's the nigga within you. Music right in your brain and slowly start to convince you. Then you let your kids listen, and then the cycle continues. Blame it all on the menu. Blame